A true champion isn't someone who never fails, but someone who never gives up on their dream. Witness the incredible journeys of those who rose from the ashes to claim their place in the sun. Click subscribe now and stay inspired by the spirit of greatness.
I was in the garage when my son stopped by that Saturday morning. He came to drop off some tools he'd borrowed 3 weeks earlier, a socket wrench set and a level I'd been looking for since spring. He stayed maybe 20 minutes. We drank coffee standing at the kitchen counter, talked about his lawn, talked about the weather getting warmer, talked about nothing in particular the way fathers and sons sometimes do when there's too much weight underneath to say anything real. Then he hugged me, told me he'd call later that week, and drove away. I stood at the window and watched his truck disappear around the corner. That was when I noticed the jacket. It was draped over the back of the dining chair closest to the door, the chair where people always set things when they're about to leave, and then forget them anyway. A gray zip-up fleece, the one my son had been wearing practically every weekend since his mother bought it for him 2 Christmases ago. She had picked it out herself. Drove to the mall, asked the woman at the counter what size, paid with her own card. He wore it the day of her funeral. I picked it up to hang it in the front closet so it wouldn't get dusty. As I lifted it from the chair, something shifted in the pocket. A slight weight. A small, dense rectangle. His phone slid halfway out and I caught it before it hit the floor. The screen lit up from the motion. I wasn't trying to look at anything. I was already turning toward the closet. But the screen was bright and right in front of my face, and what I saw on it stopped me completely. It was a photo of my wife. Not a recent photo. This was Margaret from years ago. I'd guess mid-40s, so maybe 15 years before she passed. She was standing in the backyard of the house we used to own in Dayton, the one with the big sycamore tree she always complained about because of the leaves. She was wearing a yellow blouse and squinting a little into the sun, and she was smiling the way she only smiled when she didn't know anyone was watching. Relaxed. Unguarded. Beautiful. The photo was labeled at the top of the screen. Not saved in an album. Not tucked away somewhere. It was right there, open, as if someone had been looking at it recently. And across the top of the screen, where the contact name would appear, there was a single word. Beautiful. I stood in my dining room for a long time without moving. Part of me felt something soft and sad. My son missed his mother. Of course he did. She had been gone 14 months at that point, and not a day went by that I didn't reach for her in some way, didn't turn to say something and feel the absence like a wall. It made sense that he would keep a photo. It made sense that he would look at it. The name he'd saved it under made a kind of aching, private sense. But something else moved through me too, something I couldn't name at first. I set the phone face down on the counter and finished hanging up the jacket. Then I went and sat in the armchair in the living room, Margaret's chair, the one by the window she always sat in when she read, and I tried to understand what I was feeling. It took me a while to locate it. The feeling wasn't grief, though grief was always nearby. It wasn't even suspicion. Not exactly. It was something quieter and more unsettling. A sense of a detail that didn't fit, a corner that didn't line up. My son and his mother had not been close. That's the part I couldn't reconcile. For most of his adult life, my son, I'll call him Derek, had kept his distance from Margaret in a way that was hard to explain and harder to talk about. They were polite at holidays. They exchanged phone calls on birthdays, but there was a coldness between them, a careful, managed space that both of them maintained, without ever acknowledging it directly. I had asked about it over the years, gently, and neither of them gave me a real answer. Margaret would say he was just independent. Derek would say they were just different people. I accepted that because I didn't know what else to do. But Derek saving a 15-year-old photo of his mother labeled beautiful on his phone, kept right there on his screen, recently opened, did not match the person I thought I knew. Maybe I was wrong about them, I told myself. Maybe grief had softened something. Maybe he missed her more than he ever showed. I almost left it there. I picked up his phone to set it on the side table where he'd see it when he came back for it, and I don't know exactly what happened. My thumb must have brushed the screen, because suddenly it was open, not locked. Derek had never used a passcode that I knew of, said he found them annoying. The photo app was still open. I should have put it down. I know that, but I was already looking at the album, and what I saw there made the floor feel like it had shifted 2 inches to the left. There were dozens of photos of Margaret, not just the one on the lock screen. Dozens. Going back years, some I recognized. Holidays, a trip to Asheville we'd all taken together maybe 8 years ago, a birthday dinner, but others I had never seen. Photos of Margaret in the backyard of our Dayton house at moments I didn't remember being photographed. Photos of her at what looked like a grocery store parking lot, getting into her car. Photos of her through a window. My wife. Through a window. Like someone had been watching her. I put the phone down on the counter and walked to the kitchen sink and ran cold water over my wrists, the way Margaret used to tell me to do when my blood pressure spiked. I stood there for a long time. Out the window, I could see the bird feeder she had put up the spring before she died, the one shaped like a little red barn that the squirrels were always trying to raid. I thought about her last year. Margaret had been sick for about 11 months before she died. Her heart, the doctor said. She had a condition called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, a thickening of the heart muscle that she'd been managing since her early 50s with medication and regular checkups. It was serious, but not immediately life-threatening, according to her cardiologist, a Dr. Sofik, Anand Patel, who had been treating her for 6 years. She was on a careful, monitored regimen. Then, about a year before she died, she started declining faster than expected. Fatigue first, then irregular heartbeat episodes, then 2 hospitalizations in 6 months. Dr. Patel adjusted her medications. He expressed concern but not alarm. He attributed the progression to the natural course of the disease. She died on a Tuesday in February. In her sleep, Dr. Patel certified the cause of death as cardiac arrhythmia secondary to her existing condition. There was no reason at the time to question it. Standing at my kitchen sink 14 months later, I started questioning it. I called my daughter that evening. Her name is Renee. She's 41, lives about 40 minutes north of me, and she is the kind of person who goes quiet when she's processing something serious. I have always trusted her judgment more than almost anyone's. I told her what I had found on Derek's phone. I told her about the photos, all of them. I told her about the one labeled beautiful on the lock screen, and about the photos taken through a window. I told her about the cold feeling I couldn't shake. She was quiet for a long time. "Dad," she finally said, "do you still have Dr. Patel's number?" I called Dr. Patel the next morning. I told him I was struggling with some unanswered questions about Margaret's decline, that I was having a hard time understanding why she had deteriorated so rapidly when she'd been stable for so long. I wasn't accusatory. I framed it as a grieving husband looking for peace of mind, which was true in part. Dr. Patel was kind. He pulled up her file during the call, he said, and walked me through her final year of treatment. He mentioned that around 8 months before her death, there had been a notable change in her cardiac readings, elevated sensitivity, more frequent arrhythmia events that had prompted him to review her medications carefully. He had added 1 medication and adjusted dosages on 2 others. Then he said something that stopped me cold. He said that during that same period, Margaret had come in once, asking about interactions between her heart medications and a supplement she said she'd started taking. Something a friend had recommended, she told him, for energy and circulation. He had advised her to discontinue it immediately because it could interfere with her existing medications. He had made a note of it in her file. She had told him she stopped. But her readings never really stabilized after that. "What kind of supplement?" I asked. He paused. "I wrote it down as a hawthorn-based compound," he said. But what struck me was that she wasn't sure exactly what was in it. She said her friend had given it to her already prepared, in capsules. I thanked him and hung up. A friend had given her supplements in capsules and hadn't told her what was in them. I sat at the kitchen table and tried to think clearly. My hands were not steady. I pressed them flat on the table the way you would press a piece of paper to keep it from curling. Margaret had a best friend of 23 years, a woman named Carol Sims. They had met at a book club in Dayton, stayed close through 3 moves and 1 cross-country trip, and the death of Carol's first husband, talked on the phone 2 or 3 times a week, and spent most Saturday afternoons together whenever they were in the same city. And Carol Sims had been dating my son for the past 2.5 years. I need to say that again because I know how it sounds. My son and my wife's best friend had been in a relationship since roughly 18 months before Margaret got sick. I had been uncomfortable with it from the start. The age gap alone, Carol was 54 and Derek was 38, but I had tried not to say anything because Margaret seemed to accept it, and because I thought it was not my place. Derek was a grown man. Carol was a grown woman. I told myself it was not my business. I had never once considered that it might be something worse than strange. I called Renee again that night and told her what Dr. Patel had said. I told her about the supplement. I told her about Carol. Renee went very quiet, and then she said she needed me to do something before we went any further. She asked me to call Margaret's pharmacist. Margaret had used the same pharmacy for 11 years, a small independent one about 2 miles from our house, run by a man named Phil Garrett who knew his regular customers by name and actually read what he dispensed. I called him the next morning and explained who I was. He remembered Margaret. He expressed his condolences, as he always had the 2 or 3 times I'd run into him since she passed. Then I asked him whether he had ever seen or filled any supplements for Margaret, anything outside her normal prescription regimen. Anything in the last year and a half of her life. He was quiet. Then he said that actually, yes, Margaret had come in once asking him about a supplement too. She wanted to know if it was safe to take with her heart medications. He had looked at the label she brought in and told her he had serious concerns. The compound contained a plant extract. He named it and I wrote it down, but I won't repeat it here. That, in combination with one of her existing prescriptions, could cause a dangerous buildup over time. Could cause exactly the kind of cardiac irregularities she had been experiencing. He had told her to throw it away and never take it again. He had also, he said, been meaning to mention it to Dr. Patel, but had assumed she would bring it up herself at her next appointment. She never did, because someone had given her a new batch. I don't remember the rest of that phone call. I think I thanked him. I think I said goodbye. I went and sat in Margaret's chair, and I didn't move for a very long time. The bird feeder outside the window swayed a little in the March wind. I watched it swing back and forth. My wife had been given something that could interfere with her heart medication, repeatedly, over an extended period of time, by someone she trusted completely, while the person she trusted had been in a relationship with my son, who had dozens of photographs of her on his phone, including photos taken through windows. I thought about her last year, the fatigue she apologized for, as if it were an inconvenience to the rest of us. The hospitalizations she tried to minimize because she didn't want to be a burden. The way she had looked at me in the second hospital stay and said she felt like her body was fighting something it couldn't name. She had known something was wrong. She just hadn't known what. I called Renee and told her everything. This time she didn't go quiet. She said, "Dad, I need you to write all of this down. Everything you just told me. Dr. Patel, Phil, the supplement, the photos on Derek's phone. Write it all down right now while it's clear. Then I'm coming over and we're going to figure out what to do next." She arrived within the hour. We spent that evening and most of the next day building a timeline. Dr. Patel's notes about the supplement. Phil's account of the label. The dates of Margaret's hospitalizations. The progression of her decline set against when Derek and Carol had gotten together. The photos on the phone. Renee had studied criminal justice for 2 years before switching to nursing. She knew things I didn't about evidence, about documentation, about what would and wouldn't hold up in a conversation with law enforcement. She was calm and methodical, and I have never been more grateful for a person in my entire life. We brought everything to the police on a Thursday afternoon. I want to be honest about what that was like. It was not like what you see in the movies, where you walk in and they immediately take you seriously, and the machinery of justice begins to hum. The first officer we spoke with was polite but cautious. He took notes. He said he would pass the information along. He gave us a case number. For 9 days, I heard nothing. I kept the jacket hanging in the front closet. I put Derek's phone in a kitchen drawer. He texted once asking if I'd seen his phone at my place, and I said yes. Come by and get it whenever. He said he would. He didn't. I think maybe he was trying to figure out what I knew. On the 10th day, a detective called. Her name was Holloway, and she had a voice that was measured and careful, the kind that reveals nothing on purpose. She said they had opened a formal inquiry. She said she had spoken to Dr. Patel and to Phil Garrett, and that the medical examiner was reviewing Margaret's records. She asked me not to contact Derek or Carol, and not to mention the investigation to anyone else for the time being. I asked her what they had found. She said she couldn't tell me that yet, but she thanked me for coming forward. The next 3 weeks were the longest of my life. Renee came over almost every evening. We didn't always talk about the case. Sometimes we just sat in the living room with the television on and the sound low, the way you do when silence feels too heavy to hold alone. Sometimes she would fall asleep on the couch, and I would cover her with the blanket from the hall closet, the one her mother had quilted by hand the winter Renee was born. Margaret had made a lot of things by hand. I kept finding them around the house. Reminders. The arrest came on a Monday morning. Detective Holloway called me the night before to tell me it was happening. She said she wanted me to hear it from her first. She said the medical examiner had found evidence consistent with toxic cardiac glycoside exposure, a specific compound administered gradually over time that would have been nearly impossible to detect without knowing to look for it. It had interacted with Margaret's existing heart medication in exactly the way Phil had described. The progression of her symptoms matched the exposure timeline. She said they had also recovered text messages between Derek and Carol. Communications going back nearly 3 years. Communications that made their plan clear. The motive was Margaret's life insurance policy and her stake in a property we owned jointly. She said the photos on Derek's phone were part of a longer pattern of surveillance, that he and Carol had monitored Margaret in a way that, when you laid it all out, was methodical, deliberate. She said she was sorry. She said it several times. I thanked her and sat in the kitchen until it was light outside. Derek was charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy. Carol was charged with first-degree murder, not accessory murder, based on the evidence that she had obtained and repeatedly administered the substance. A judge remanded both of them without bail, pending trial. The trial lasted 11 days. Renee sat beside me every day. Our pastor came for part of it. Margaret's sister flew in from Portland and held my hand through the closing arguments. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. Derek was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Carol was convicted of first-degree murder and received the same sentence. The judge, in her remarks before sentencing, said that what the two of them had done was among the most calculated violations of human trust she had encountered in 22 years on the bench. She said that Margaret's life had mattered and that the court intended to reflect that. I don't cry easily. I am 67 years old, and I buried both my parents and my wife and 2 friends I loved deeply, and grief has taught me to hold things quietly. But I cried in that courtroom. I let Renee hold my hand, and I cried, and I didn't try to stop it. There are things I still struggle with. I struggle with the fact that I sat across a kitchen counter from my son the morning before I found that phone and talked to him about his lawn. I try not to turn that over too much because there is no bottom to it if you let yourself fall in. I struggle with Carol. 23 years of Margaret's friendship, birthday calls, emergency drives to the hospital, the kind of intimacy that women build with each other over decades that men sometimes can't fully understand. And Carol had used all of it as cover. She had been in our house. She had eaten at our table. She had held Margaret's hand. I struggle with the question of whether Margaret ever suspected, whether in those last months, as her body failed in ways she couldn't account for, she had a feeling she couldn't name. I hope she didn't. I hope she went to sleep that February night believing she was simply tired and that morning would feel better. But I also think about what Margaret would have said if the situation had been reversed, if I had been the one who found something that didn't fit, who had a feeling I couldn't explain, who almost let it go and didn't. She would have said, "Good. You didn't let it go." She was always braver than me about the things that mattered. I think about the phone. I think about the particular way it slid from that pocket and landed in my hand at exactly the right angle. Screen lit, photo open, that one word at the top. Beautiful. Derek saved that photo under that name, and I don't know why. I don't know if it was guilt, or sentiment, or something I'm not able to understand. The detective said it wasn't unusual in cases like this, that perpetrators sometimes hold on to strange souvenirs of the person they've wronged, for reasons that don't reduce to anything clean or logical. I think about Margaret in that yellow blouse in the Dayton backyard, squinting into the sun and smiling when she thought no one was watching. She was, in fact, beautiful. In every way that word can mean. I kept the bird feeder up. I fill it every week. The squirrels still try to raid it, and I shoo them away the same way she did, banging on the window, saying, "Oh, you little bandits," under my breath, because I heard her say it so many times it became mine too. Renee comes for dinner on Sundays. We cook things from the recipe box on the counter, the one with the handwritten index cards and her mother's script. It is the best part of my week. The jacket is still in the front closet. I don't know what to do with it. Maybe that's something I'll figure out in time. There is no version of this story that is okay. I want to be honest about that. There is no silver lining that makes what happened to Margaret acceptable. No lesson that justifies what she lost, what we all lost. Justice is not restoration. It is something smaller and more limited than that. And anyone who tells you otherwise has not sat where I sat. But I'll tell you what it is. It's the difference between a truth that exists and a truth that has been buried. It is the thing that keeps the people who knew her from having to carry a lie on top of their grief. That morning in March, when I carried a gray zip-up jacket to the closet and a phone slipped into my hand and a screen lit up with a photo of the woman I'd loved for 39 years, I almost put it down. I am grateful every single day that I didn't. If you were standing where I was standing, and I hope to God you never are, I just want you to know, trust the thing you can't explain. Don't talk yourself out of the detail that doesn't fit. There are people in your life who are depending on you to stay awake. Take care of each other. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this ended. Not in an abstract way, in the very practical, human way that you think about it when you've watched the consequences of someone's choices play out in real time, in a courtroom, in a sentence read aloud by a judge. Derek and Carol didn't end up where they ended up because of bad luck. They ended up there because every choice they made, every calculated, deliberate step, carried its own weight forward. The plan they built together was careful and patient, and for a while it worked. But careful and patient plans built on harm tend to carry the seeds of their own unraveling, not through any mystical force, but through something simpler and more reliable. The sheer number of details that have to hold. One phone in one jacket pocket on one ordinary Saturday morning, that's all it took. Not fate, just the arithmetic of a deception that was too large to stay hidden forever. I think about the three things that made the difference in this story, and none of them were dramatic. They were quiet. Margaret's cardiologist kept meticulous notes. Still at the pharmacy remembered a conversation from a year and a half before I called him. And an ordinary 67-year-old man, standing in his own dining room, didn't talk himself out of a feeling he couldn't explain. That last one is the one I want to sit with for a moment. There is a kind of intelligence that doesn't come from education or credentials. It's the intelligence of paying attention to the detail that doesn't fit, to the question you almost don't ask, to the moment you almost walk away from. I almost walked away. I want to be honest about that. I held that phone for a few seconds and almost set it face down and went about my day. What stopped me was not courage exactly. It was something quieter. A refusal to be incurious about the people I love. I think that refusal is something we can all practice, not suspicion. Suspicion is exhausting and corrosive, and it damages things that don't deserve to be damaged. But attention, presence, the willingness to stay with discomfort long enough to understand what it's telling you. And then there is the question of what you do with what you find. Renee showed me that. She didn't panic and she didn't freeze. She said, "Write it down, then we figure out what to do next." That is a kind of moral steadiness that I admire more than almost any other quality in a person. The ability to hold something terrible without either collapsing under it or being hardened by it. To stay functional in the presence of grief because the truth requires your full attention. Margaret deserved that. She deserved people who stayed awake on her behalf, even when it was hard, even when the answer was something none of us wanted to find. The people who wronged her will spend the rest of their lives with the consequences of what they chose to do. That is not a comfort exactly, but it is a kind of truth, that actions accumulate, that harm does not disappear, that the weight of what we do to other people does not evaporate simply because time passes. Live with integrity. Stay curious about the people you love, and when something doesn't add up, trust yourself enough to stay in the room.